entitled The Situation in the Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war are amongst the first very words of the UN Charter in its preamble. And those words were the main motivation for creating the United Nations, whose founders had lived through the devastation of 2 world wars by 1945. The United Nations hold as its mandate Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations, that disputes or situations in which peace may be broken shall be settled by peaceful means and in conformity with justice and the principles of international law. It is therefore one of the purposes of the United Nations to maintain peace and security in accordance with the rule of law. In the last 76 years of the existence of the United Nations, it has taught us, if it has taught us anything, then it is that the lasting peace is not achieved nor sustained by military engagements, but through political solutions. And the most effective way to diminish human suffering and the massive economic costs of conflicts and their aftermath is to prevent conflicts in the first place. My dear colleagues, let's deploy the tools that we have to resolve disputes. Let's give priority to diplomacy, good offices, and mediation. Let's give peace all the chance it deserves. Full commitment to the United Nations Charter, its purposes and its principles is the only path to ensure lasting peace. I call on all parties to intensify their negotiations and de-escalate the current trajectory through dialogue. I would like to conclude my statement by quoting former Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, who 68 years ago said that the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. I thank you. I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We meet in the face of the most serious global peace and security crisis in recent years, and certainly in my time as Secretary General. Our world is facing a moment of peril. I truly hoped it would not come. The latest developments regarding Ukraine are a cause of grave concern, and they include reports of increased ceasefire violations across the contact line and the real risk of further escalation on the ground. My thoughts are with all those who have already suffered so much death, destruction, and displacement. The history of this conflict is complex, and at least 2 permanently opposing narratives. I know that their authors will never agree on what happened in the past. But in the present situation, one thing is clear. The decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and the follow-up are violations of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And here, in this hallowed hall, I must emphasize that this action is also inconsistent with the landmark resolution adopted by the General Assembly more than half a century ago. I refer to the Declaration on Principles of International Law, concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. The so-called Friendly Relations Declaration was adopted during the General Assembly session marking the 25th anniversary of the United Nations. And the Friendly Relations Declaration, which has been cited repeatedly by the International Court of Justice as representing international law, sets out several vital principles that are highly relevant to today's session. In particular, I would note the principle of sovereign equality of states and the affirmation that the territorial integrity and political independence of the state are inviolable. Other resolutions of the General Assembly are also fully behind the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, the Minsk agreements approved by the Security Council and that I strongly supported from the beginning were surviving in an intensive care unit thanks to a number of life support devices. But now those devices have been disconnected. We must also be concerned about preserving the integrity of peacekeeping. The United Nations has a long and recognized experience deploying peacekeeping operations which only take place with the consent of the host country. Mr. President, it's time for restraint, reason, and de-escalation. There is no place for actions and statements that would take this dangerous situation over the abyss. It's time to establish a ceasefire and return to the path of dialogue and negotiations to save the people in Ukraine and beyond from the scourge of war. I urge all parties to make full use of Article 33 of the Charter and its diverse instruments of pacific settlement of disputes. Mr. President, the United Nations system is continuing to support the people in Ukraine through our human rights and humanitarian work. Our human rights monitoring mission has 7 offices throughout the country on both sides of the contact line, documenting civilian casualties, monitoring freedom of movement, and reporting on allegations of human rights violations. Our humanitarian operations are independent of whoever might control the territory where people are living. Even before this latest escalation, 2 million people in Ukraine needed humanitarian assistance. And since the start of 2022 alone, we and our partners have delivered 140 metric tons of life-saving aid across the contact line. Here again, our actions are based entirely on humanitarian principles endorsed by the General Assembly. United Nations humanitarian assistance is guided by 4 humanitarian principles: humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And these priorities are central to establishing and maintaining access to affected people, including those in the context of an armed conflict. The General Assembly has repeatedly underscored the importance of promoting and respecting these principles within the framework of humanitarian assistance. Our humanitarian agencies are committing to staying and delivering to support the people in Ukraine, and are ready to readjust and reprioritize their operations as necessary. As we sadly know all too well, in conflict, civilians, including women and children, always suffer first and suffer most. If the conflict in Ukraine expands, the world could see a scale and severity of need unseen for many years. I urge all sides to allow safe and unimpeded access by humanitarian agencies, including in non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine. All parties must uphold their obligations and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, I'm fully committed to support all efforts to resolve this crisis without further bloodshed. My good offices remain available. We cannot and will not relent in the search for a peaceful solution. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished Foreign Minister, His Excellency Dmytro Kuleba, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
President, Secretary General, I'm grateful for your leadership in this main policy-making and representative organ of the United Nations. Mr. President, you have chosen the word hope as a motto for your presidency. The same feeling currently dominates the mindsets of Ukrainians and people around the globe. Hope for peace, hope for common sense to prevail, hope for diplomacy to ease tensions. However, today we need much more than hope. We need swift, concrete, and resolute actions. A new type of actions by the United Nations and international community which is relevant to the level of the threat we all, not just Ukraine, face today because of Russia's aggressive course. The people of Ukraine need these actions by Ukraine's strategic partners and international community. We are at a critical juncture in world history, and our actions today define it for decades to come. We all read history books. We all watched movies about the mistake politicians made in the run-up to 1914 and 1939, about the feats of our grandparents and the catastrophic price at which a revanchist evil in Europe was defeated. There is no more important task today than to not repeat the mistakes of the past. I do believe in the power of the free world and our joint ability to avert a new devastating catastrophe in Europe that no nation will be able to sit out. This is why today I address you on behalf of over 40 million of Ukrainians who only wish to live in peace and prosperity, not in fear, intimidation, not under Russian fire, bombs, and shelling. We are currently at the middle of the largest security crisis in Europe since the Second World War. This crisis was created and is being escalated by one side unilaterally, by the Russian Federation. Russia's accusations of Ukraine are absurd. Ukraine has never threatened or attacked anyone. Ukraine has never planned and does not plan any such action. Ukraine has never planned and does not plan any military offensive in the Donbas, neither any provocations or acts of sabotage. It is ultimately absurd to suggest that Ukraine could have prepared for anything like this and waited for months until Russia amassed an enormous military force along our borders to proceed with such alleged plans. This absurdity defies basic logic. Not less absurd are accusations of Ukraine escalating by acquiring defensive weapons from its partners. I want to stress it, the only reason for Ukraine to boost its defenses is Russia's ongoing and planned military and political actions. Russia's actions and statements are outrageous, horrific, and go far beyond threatening Ukraine. In fact, in his address this week, Russian President Vladimir Putin overtly denied Ukraine's right to exist. Anyone who might think I exaggerate as the Ukrainian foreign minister should just watch this horrifying speech. It is with a heavy heart that we all need to admit the grim reality of a new aggressive and revanchist rule rising over Europe. This is the fourth time that the General Assembly debates the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. However, this is the first time we debate the situation in the new reality created by the illegal recognition of two territories of Ukraine by Russia. And the backdrop of our discussion today is much more dangerous as Russia attacked the very fundamental principles of international peace and security. The pillars of the United Nations, and, as I mentioned, the very existence of the Ukrainian state, a founding member of the United Nations. Ukraine, that signed the UN Charter in San Francisco in 1945 and made the principle enshrined in Article 2 of the Charter a cornerstone of its foreign policy. A state that voluntarily gave up its nuclear arsenal under the security assurances of nuclear powers. A state that has endured years of assault by one of these powers, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. 2 days ago, on February 21st, the Russian president recognized so-called independence of the temporarily occupied parts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine and ordered the deployment of the Russian armed forces in these areas. This is an on-front attack on the United Nations and core principles of international law, an ultimate blow to years of peace process and Russia's unilateral withdrawal from the Minsk agreements. What is happening right now in eastern Ukraine, where Russian tanks are rolling in, and along the Ukrainian borders, where Russian forces are amassed in enormous quantities, must be a concern for everyone, for all of you. I warn every nation in this distinguished chamber, no one will be able to sit out this crisis if President Putin decides that he can move forward with his aggression against Ukraine. Your governments and your people will face painful consequences together with our government and our people. This is why we need to use this last chance for action and stop Russia where it is. It is clear that President Putin will not stop by himself. Distinguished representatives, the beginning of a large-scale war in Ukraine will be the end of the world order as we know it. If Russia does not get a severe, swift, and decisive response now, this will mean a total bankruptcy of the international security system and international institutions which are tasked with maintaining the global security order. This is a grim scenario which will throw us back to the darkest times of the 20th century. Russia will not stop at Ukraine. If a permanent member of the UN Security Council succeeds in breaking literally all rules, other actors will be inspired by him and follow his pattern. What he tries to do now is to prove that the United Nations are weak, indecisive, and unable to defend their core principles, that rules do not apply to him, to Russia, to Putin. What role for the United Nations does Russia see? A new League of Nations. We must deny Russia what it wants. I graduated from the university with a degree in international law and strong belief in multilateralism. Many years after practicing diplomacy, I still do believe in both rules containing aggression and the power of our collective and firm action. If the United Nations make a pivot right now to become a strong and proactive player which is not afraid of resolute actions and using all of its might and powers, I am confident that Russia will stop. In this context, I welcome yesterday's statement by the United Nations Secretary General, which is truly different in tone. We need decisive actions of the same kind to follow these right words. Russia shows signs of readiness to further escalate its aggression against Ukraine, and we have limited time to stop, deter, and contain it. Every hour of inaction now is a threat to the lives of Ukrainians. Not only military, but also civilians, including women and children. This is an escalating threat to our collective global security and to our freedom. Ukraine expects decisive, immediate, and proportional actions by the international community. The United Nations is the organization that has to demonstrate leadership, not just condemnations. Concrete actions to stop the Russian machine of war without stepping into a bloody conflict with many thousands of casualties, devastation, and suffering. I do not want this. Ukraine doesn't want this. The world doesn't want this. We need your help right now to stop Russia from proceeding with its aggressive plans. Ukraine believes in diplomacy. We see no alternative to peaceful solutions by political and diplomatic means. There is still an opportunity for diplomacy to say its word, even as Russia continues its escalation and provocations. For months, Russia pretended to pursue diplomacy while bringing more and more troops to our borders and in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Now this number stands at least at 150,000. Under the OSCE Vienna document on confidence and security building measures, such actions fall under the qualification of unusual military activities that would require explanation. However, Russia has persistently refused to provide it. Instead, it proceeded with threats. Russia has literally stuffed the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov with at least 46 military vessels. It routinely closes large parts of the seas under the pretext of holding naval exercises. In practice, it amounts almost to a blockade of Ukrainian seaports. This is already an attack on the global freedom of navigation, one of the sacred principles of international law. Russia's propaganda machine is in full swing. It desperately tries to create a pretext for further aggression against Ukraine. We resolutely reject all Russian insinuations about any alleged Ukrainian offensive military operations in Donbas. We do not hold or plan any such actions. We remain committed to political and diplomatic settlement, and together with our partners, we maximize efforts to reduce tensions and keep the situation in line with diplomatic dialogue. For now, we see that Russian occupation forces have already significantly increased shelling of Ukrainian territory and civilian infrastructure. Artillery fire at the contact line in the Donbas from the occupied territory hit a kindergarten in a town called Stanitsa Luhanska and a school in Vrubivka, among the latest terrible examples. Recognition of the so-called republics has no legal implications. It merely confirms Russia's own involvement as a party to the armed conflict in Donbas, which Russia vehemently denied all these years. The situation in the occupied Donbas has already been terrible for years, with residents living in the atmosphere of fear, lawlessness, and insecurity. The infamous secret prison called Izolyatsiya in the occupied Donetsk remains inaccessible for human rights and humanitarian missions. It continues to function as a literal concentration camp in Europe in the 21st century. Hundreds of people have passed through this camp and were subjected to heavy forced labor, humiliation, tortures. Cases of extrajudicial killings have been reported too. Russia continues to block the release of the illegally detained persons. In September 2029, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, handed over to the Secretary General the list of more than 100 Ukrainians from Donbas and Crimea who had been unlawfully detained, sentenced, or even transferred from the occupied territories to the Russian Federation. We reiterate our call on the Secretary General to provide good offices and facilitate their immediate release. And I appreciate the readiness of the Secretary General to do so. Mr. President, today, Ukraine defends not only global security, but also freedom, democracy, and fundamental principles of international law. Peaceful life and the future of millions of people in Europe and around the globe rely on the rules that Russia tries to destroy. Diplomacy and international fora must prevail and stop the Russian aggression. Since 2014, the General Assembly has already adopted 11 resolutions reaffirming its commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemning the temporary occupation of Ukraine's territories by Russia. The General Assembly has not and will not accept the Russian mantra that the case of Crimea is closed, end of quote. The occupying power persists in destroying the identity of Ukrainians and the indigenous people of the peninsula, the Crimean Tatars. Since 2014, more than 64,000 Ukrainian citizens have had to leave Crimea and moved to mainland Ukraine due to fear, persecution for political and human rights activism, discrimination on ethnic and religious grounds. Political persecutions continue unabated. Among many others, Mr. Nariman Jelalov, deputy head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, participant of the International Crimea Platform Summit, remains behind bars. He is one of more than 100 political prisoners of the Kremlin. On February 16, a court in Simferopol sentenced journalist Vladislav Yesipenko on trumped-up charges to 6 years in prison. He is one of 14 Ukrainian journalists kept by Russians in prison. Russia may continue to pretend it doesn't violate any international norms and principles. Yet, reports by the UN Security Secretary General, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OSCE, their missions, as well as the report of the International Criminal Court prosecutor, all testify to the contrary. If Russia doesn't agree with all the mentioned resolutions and reports, it should simply provide access to Crimea, to the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. The access of international organizations to the occupied territories is critical. Ukraine guarantees such access throughout the government-controlled territory and continues to demand from the Russian side to do the same in the occupied territories. Esteemed members of the General Assembly, the whole world witnesses today that Russia turns to threatening and blackmailing the global community to close the Crimea case. End of quote. It is, in fact, one of the points in the long list of its recent so-called security demands. Ukraine continues efforts to achieve the occupation of Crimea by peaceful means. The Crimea platform is a tool designed exactly for that end. We are truly thankful to all the countries supporting the International Crimea Platform. Your active involvement in the platform is a sound foundation for our future success. We are open to new members, and I call on you to join the Crimea Platform. Be it states or international organizations, you are welcome. We expect the United Nations will find proper modalities to engage with this initiative established on the principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, dear colleagues, Ukraine made a historic contribution to global security. In 1994, we denuclearized, giving up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. We have no plans to regain nuclear weapons. Today, we expect the world reciprocally to ensure our security with relevant scale and resoluteness of actions in the face of a historic level of threat. This is the reason why Ukraine requested urgent consultations under Article 6 of the Budapest Memorandum. The world owes Ukraine its security. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky initiated a new format of negotiations to settle the security crisis created by Russia. 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Ukraine, Germany, and Turkey. This is the format that we are trying to convene. I reaffirm that Ukraine proposed some years ago to deploy a UN peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. Until now, United Nations Security Council has failed to take necessary decisions. Ukraine proposes to combine stark sanctions policy and strengthening of Ukraine together with keeping diplomatic channels open to persuade Russia to de-escalate and prioritize diplomacy. We urge member states to use all available means to protect Ukraine and deter Russia. Whatever action you can take is appreciated. We are grateful for the actions already taken by many of you. We expect the international community to do its best to put out the fire in the center of Europe, which is about to flare up. The Russian security crisis must end with Russia returning to the path of diplomacy. We call on all states and international organizations not to recognize any alteration of the status of the certain areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine, and to refrain from any action of dealing that might be interpreted as recognizing any such altered status. The absence of proper reaction or a neutral stance will only contribute to further escalation and sufferings. And, I regret to say it, it will not be limited to Ukraine's border and territory. On the contrary, active diplomacy, strong political messaging, tough economic sanctions, and strengthening Ukraine can still force Moscow to abandon aggressive plans. Swift and resolute actions by the United Nations can reclaim the organization's leading role at this historic and dark moment. Russia must withdraw its forces from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Russia must stop destabilizing the international security situation. We Ukrainians want peace, and we want to resolve all issues through diplomacy. We stand ready for all possible scenarios and ready to protect our land and our people if Russia further attacks. Ukraine will not hesitate to exercise its inherent right of self-defense as outlined in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations in response to the armed attacks of the Russian Federation. These days, we have probably the last window of opportunity to do what Russia does not expect the United Nations and its member states to do. Demonstrate unprecedented ability and readiness to act in order to stop aggression. No matter what relations you develop among each other, it is your ultimate duty to defend the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Lord Ahmed, Minister for South Asia and North Africa, the United Nations, and the Commonwealth at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Your Excellencies, The United Kingdom is unwavering in its support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. We stand with the people of Ukraine. We stand with their right to determine their own future. President Putin's decision to recognize the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic as independent states proves beyond doubt that Russia has chosen the path of confrontation over the path of diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. Putin has ordered his troops into Ukrainian territory. This amounts to a further invasion of Ukraine. Mr. President, at every step, Russia has rebuffed offers of diplomacy and indeed discarded its international commitments. Commitments it has itself agreed and signed up to. Rather, it has pursued a campaign to withdraw Ukraine's internationally recognized borders by force. It is vital that we, the United Nations, the international community, must respond. We must understand the grave nature of where we are today. And together we must call on Russia to uphold the very founding principles of this, the United Nations, established precisely, as you said yourself, Mr. President, to end the scourge of war. Peace must prevail. We must highlight the human cost and respond to the humanitarian consequences of any further Russian military action. We know this will take a terrible toll on Ukrainians, but also it will take a toll on Russians alike, both victims of an unnecessary war of the Kremlin's choosing. And it's therefore essential that we must meet Russia's aggressive acts with solidarity, with strength, including through coordinated sanctions, to impose a severe cost on Russian interests and their economy. Yesterday, the United Kingdom announced new sanctions targeting billions of Russian assets. This is the largest sanctions package against Russia in British history, and it is part of our coordinated sanctions effort alongside our allies. But, Mr. President, we are clear that acting together with our allies, this is just the start. If Russia continues its campaign of aggression, we have a further package of sanctions ready to go. We urge the wider international community to join us in this effort. The Kremlin must understand the strength of the world's condemnation of President Putin's war of choice. Mr. President, let us pause for a moment. Let us reflect. This very week marks 8 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. It also marks 8 years since Russia's forcibly seized 10,000 square miles of sovereign Ukrainian territory, in flagrant violation of international law and Russia's own international commitments. And it's also 8 years since we, the General Assembly of the United Nations, recalled through Resolution 68262 the obligations of all states under Article 2 of the UN Charter to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state of the United Nations. Yet, 8 years on, tragically, here we are again, confronted by Russian aggression against the sovereignty of Ukraine. And as Secretary General Antonio Guterres has made clear, Russia's unilateral measures conflict directly with the very principles of the United Nations Charter. Their actions are a fundamental challenge to global peace and security, and a challenge to the international order on which we all rely. And equally important, it is for all of us to protect. We must condemn unequivocally this aggression together and stop President Putin's expansionist ambitions. Mr. President, we must hold Russia true to its commitments under the UN Charter and say to Russia very clearly, pull back, choose peace, not war, whilst also sending a very clear message to the people of Ukraine that in your hour of need, we, the international community, we, the United Nations, stand with you. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for South Asia, North Africa, the United Nations, and the Commonwealth at the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to His Excellency Tobias Linde, Minister of State for the Federal Foreign Office of Germany.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we meet today in a time of challenge. A couple of days ago, the president of a member state of this organization put into question the statehood of another distinguished member of this organization. He said, and I quote, "Ukraine actually never had stable traditions of statehood," unquote. We must take this sentence very seriously. Some important questions arise. What does it mean for this organization if one state construes the existence of another state as a regrettable accident of history, thereby questioning its right to exist? What does it mean for a common objective of promoting peace and development if more countries try to roll back history in a similar way? What does it mean for the multilateral rules-based order if states think they can, due to their own view of history, domineer over other states and put them under tutelage? We still do not have answers to all of these questions. What is clear already now, Russia's decision to recognize the self-proclaimed so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk could be a deadly blow for the international rules-based order, for the way this organization has functioned over the last decades. Russia is violating the core principles of the UN Charter. We need to close ranks and strongly reject such action. If not, then what has hit Ukraine today could happen to other UN member states tomorrow. Everybody in this assembly should be aware of this. It is therefore with utmost gratitude that we took note of the Secretary General's words. He said, "The principles of the UN Charter are not a menu a la carte. They cannot be applied selectively. Member states have accepted them all, and they must apply them all." Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing to add to these crystal clear words. Russia's irresponsible and provocative action comes at a time of a massive military buildup alongside Ukraine's borders. We have seen a concerning flare-up of ceasefire violations along the line of contact. We have witnessed a disturbing flow of disinformation and false flag operations meant to create pretexts for military incursion. This time of increased tensions, where people's lives are at risk, would have been the time to go for de-escalation, to heed the Security Council's repeated calls for diplomatic efforts. Instead, Russia chose to again attack Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity 8 years after Russia had illegally seized and annexed Crimea. The General Assembly condemned this UN Charter violation, and it should do so again. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I commend Ukraine's continued restraint in the face of this aggression. President Zelensky's commitment to finding a peaceful diplomatic way out. Since 2014, France and Germany have done their utmost to work towards a political solution of the conflict in eastern Ukraine on the basis of the Minsk agreements. Russia's signature is under these agreements. Over the last weeks, Chancellor Scholz and my Foreign Minister Baerbock have left no stone unturned to engage with Russia diplomatically in close coordination with our French partners. We are willing to chart a way forward, strengthening trust, stability, and security in Europe. We have the framework established to do this in the NATO-Russia Council, in the OSCE, and in the Normandy format. The ceasefire in the Donbass must be observed immediately. We condemn the use of heavy weaponry and indiscriminate shelling of civilian infrastructure, which constitutes a clear violation of the Minsk agreements. This must stop. We commend the OSCE Special Representative for trying to convene an extraordinary session of the Trilateral Contact Group. France, Ukraine, and my country stand ready for another meeting in the Normandy format or for the summit that Ukraine has proposed. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is vital for monitoring the situation in eastern Ukraine. This is why Germany's seconded staff remains on the ground. The SMM must be allowed to carry out its mandate in full. We want to resolve this crisis by diplomacy. To this end, Russia must immediately change its course of action. First, I urge Russia to de-escalate now, to withdraw its troops from Ukraine, in particular from the self-proclaimed entities and the Crimean Peninsula, as well as from Ukraine's borders. Second, Russia must refrain from any action which would further fuel the risk of a full-fledged military conflict with Ukraine. Third, I urge Russia to immediately repeal its decision to recognize the separatist entities. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, do we respect the territorial integrity and sovereign equality of UN member states? Do we stand by the UN Charter? I call on all member states to reaffirm our commitment to these principles over Ukraine and beyond. With our allies and partners, Germany will spare no effort to find a diplomatic way forward. We will be steadfast in our support for Ukraine and our support for the UN Charter. It is a common duty to remain committed to a rules-based order, to trustful cooperation, to bringing forward a common goal of lasting peace and stability. We invite every member of this organization to join these efforts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, is the moment to speak up and defend the international order of the UN Charter against unilateral aggression jointly and decisively. I thank you.
I thank the Minister of State of the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your presence and for your briefing this morning, and for, with the legal, moral, and political authority of your office, clarifying the implications of what we are now seeing on the European continent and how it relates to the UN Charter. Mr. President, I will speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland and Norway, Georgia and Monaco align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, the European Union recalls its unwavering support to the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We strongly condemn the decision by the President Putin to recognize the non-government-controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine as independent entities and the ensuing decision to send Russian troops into these areas. If there was any uncertainty, the Secretary General has made clear that the decision of the Russian Federation is a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of this United Nations. They undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and are a severe breach of international law and international agreements, including the UN Charter, Helsinki Final Act, Paris Charter, and the Budapest Memorandum. With this decision, Russia is clearly violating the Minsk agreements. The European Union strongly condemns Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine, including through the unprecedented military buildup near the border with Ukraine and in the Black Sea, and through the deployment of combat forces in and the joint drills with Belarus, and calls on Russia to de-escalate, to abide by international law, and to engage constructively in dialogue through the established international mechanisms. The EU is responding to these latest violations with additional restrictive measures, including on all economic relations with the non-governmental controlled areas, as well as designations against individuals and entities responsible for undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine, in coordination with our partners. Russia's past and present actions against Ukraine are not a matter just for Ukraine or for Europe. They have severe global implications. Violations of fundamental principles of international law and the UN Charter directed towards another state is of serious global concern. These rules apply to all, and permanent members of the Security Council have particular responsibility in upholding the Charter. The EU fully subscribes to and for its part reaffirms our full commitment to the core principles of European security, enshrined in the UN Charter and the commitments Russia itself has subscribed to. This includes notably the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states, the inviolability of frontiers, refraining from the threat or use of force, and the freedom of states to choose or change their own security arrangements. These principles are neither negotiable nor subject to revision or reinterpretation. Their violation by Russia is an obstacle to a common security space in Europe and threatens the peace and stability in Europe and worldwide. What is happening in Ukraine affects the security of each and every UN member state. We therefore call on Russia to respect the principles of the Charter, to de-escalate and to engage in the kind of meaningful diplomacy that we have offered and that the Secretary General has reiterated and supported. Mr. President, we call on Russia to constructively engage in the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group to achieve the full implementation of the Minsk agreements endorsed by the Security Council Resolution 2202. Russia needs urgently to de-escalate tensions caused by the military buildup along its border with Ukraine and on Crimea, and cease the provocation and aggressive rhetoric. Russia must change course and constructively contribute to negotiations in the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group, in line with what was agreed in recent N4 meeting in Paris and Berlin. We welcome the OSCE Special Representative's attempts to convene extraordinary sessions of the Trilateral Contact Group to diffuse tensions, and we expect Russia to accept the invitation to such a meeting in the future. We also call on Russia to immediately stop fueling the conflict and remove Russian troops and hardware illegally deployed in areas currently not under the control of the government of Ukraine. The EU strongly condemns the recent increase of ceasefire violations, as well as orders for mobilization issued by the de facto authorities in areas currently not under control of the government of Ukraine. We condemn the use of heavy weaponry and recalls that the shelling of civilian infrastructures represents a clear violation of the ceasefire, the Minsk agreements, and international humanitarian law. The EU commends Ukraine's posture and restraint in the face of continued provocations and efforts at destabilization, as we've just heard from this rostrum this morning by the Foreign Minister. The EU underlines the role of the OSCE as the appropriate forum to address security concerns of all interested parties, including Russia. EU member states are ready to engage in strengthening the existing mechanisms to ensure military transparency and predictability, and to support efforts regarding arms control, in particular within the OSCE framework. In this regard, we urge Russia to abide by its commitments under the Vienna document, and notably to provide full transparency on its military activities in the region, to host visits to the areas which are the cause of concern, to take significant and verifiable steps to de-escalate the situation, and to provide information on the reported redeployment of Russian units from the locations of military exercises. We also express our support for the valuable engagement of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, the SMM, and its impartial monitoring. We're therefore deeply concerned by Russia's continued actions to obstruct the presence of the SMM in the non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. The SMM is mandated to monitor the entire territory of Ukraine within its international recognized borders, including in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We urge Russia to respect the mandate of the SMM as agreed by all participating states and ensure that all restrictions affecting the mission's work are lifted immediately. We once again implore the targeting of assets of the mission. The volatile security situation in eastern Ukraine has an immense impact on the civilian population, in particular persons in the most vulnerable situations living in the non-government controlled areas and along both sides of the contact line, where people are under continuous threat of shelling, and we share a profound concern for their sufferings. As a result of the conflict, 2.9 million Ukrainians are still in need of humanitarian assistance. We call on the sides to respect international humanitarian law and guarantee unhindered and sustained access for humanitarian actors, including UNHCR and other UN agencies, as well as national and international NGOs, to all people in need. The EU, together with its 27 member states, is the biggest donor of humanitarian aid to Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict. The EU will continue to support humanitarian organizations. Mr. President, let me turn to the situation in Crimea. These days, we commemorate 8 years since the beginning of the hostile Russian political and military actions against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, leading to the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. This illegal annexation and Russia's subsequent actions on the peninsula and in surrounding waters are in blatant breach of international law and of key principles of the rules-based international order. They remain a direct challenge to international security with grave implications for the international law that protects the sovereignty, territorial integrity and unity of all states. In line with the resolutions of this General Assembly, the EU reconfirms its condemnation of this violation of international law and continue to implement its consistent non-recognition policy of the illegal annexation, including through restrictive measures, together with transatlantic partners. As stated in Resolution 68262, the so-called referendum organized by Russia on the Crimean Peninsula in March 2014 has no legal validity. And we recall the obligation of all states not to recognize as lawful any territorial acquisition of special advantage resulting from aggression. And we call on all UN member states to remain steadfast in their policy of non-recognition of Russia's illegal annexation. We welcome Ukraine's efforts to continue to seek justice using international legal instruments and courts. The ongoing Russian militarization of the Crimean Peninsula has a negative impact on the security situation in the Black Sea region and beyond, and we call on Russia to refrain from impeding the lawful exercise of navigational rights and freedoms to and from the Sea of Azov in accordance with international law. We affirm the universal and unified character of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We remain seriously concerned about transfers by the Russian Federation of sophisticated weapons systems and military personnel to the peninsula since March 2014. As documented in the reports by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Russian citizenship and conscription in the armed forces of the Russian Federation have been imposed on Crimean residents in violation of international humanitarian law. Russian legislative elections have been illegally held in the legally annexed Crimea, and a population census conducted in an attempt to legitimize the illegal annexation of the peninsula. All these developments are extremely worrying and hostile. The EU remains deeply concerned about the severe deterioration of human rights situation in the Crimean Peninsula since its illegal annexation by the Russian Federation. Residents of the peninsula face systematic violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as the rights to freedom of expression, religion or belief and association, and the right to peaceful assembly. Arbitrary detentions and convictions remain systemic. In particular, the human rights situation of the Crimean Tatars have been targeted. In accordance with the UN General Assembly Resolution 76179, adopted last December, it is crucial that regional and international human rights monitoring mechanisms, as well as non-governmental human rights organizations, are granted proper and unimpeded access to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Journalists, media workers, human rights defenders, and defense lawyers should be able to work independently and without undue interference and intimidation. Mr. President, the EU reaffirms our commitment to further support Ukraine's resilience, including encountering cyber and hybrid threats and tackling disinformation. The EU underlines the importance of Ukraine's reform agenda based on democracy, rule of law, respect for international law and human rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, let me reiterate once again our firm belief that tensions and disagreements must be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy, and that this issue is not only a matter of regional concern, but of a global. Threats and violations of international law, including the UN Charter, affect all member states of the UN and all people of the world. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lithuania on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Lithuania. All our countries have aligned with the statement of the European Union. Mr. President, despite the repeated calls for serious de-escalation by the UN Secretary General and recent intensive diplomatic efforts at all levels, Russia keeps dramatically escalating its aggressive actions against Ukraine. We strongly condemn the decision by President Putin to recognize the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine as independent entities and the ensuing decision to send Russian troops into these areas under the pretext of so-called peacekeeping. We call on Russia to reverse these decisions. As clearly stated by UN Secretary General and political leaders of our countries, these illegal acts further undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and constitute a severe breach of international law and international agreements, including the UN Charter, Helsinki Final Act, Paris Charter, and Budapest Memorandum. We underline that Russian forces in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine would be nothing else than an invasion of a sovereign state. Calling them peacekeepers, to quote the Secretary General, is the perversion of the concept of peacekeeping. By these illegal acts, Russia is breaking its commitment to work with the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group in finding a peaceful settlement to the conflict. It is also violating UN Security Council Resolution 2202, which requires full implementation of the Minsk agreements. The Russian Federation's use of force against Ukraine is completely unjustified and unacceptable and must be met with unity, firmness, and determination, including through additional sanctions in solidarity with Ukraine. Russia's continued aggressive actions and threats against Ukraine and its recent unprecedented and large-scale military buildup in Ukraine and near its borders, including through deployment of combat forces in and the joint drills with Belarus, pose a threat not only to European, but also to the global security. In addition, Russia's increased military presence in the Black Sea and in the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula, as well as the closure of the large parts of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, add to the threat of escalation also in the maritime sphere. Non-adherence to international law and its fundamental principles undermines the rules-based international order and effective multilateralism. We underscore the crucial importance of upholding these principles, including to the right of all states to the sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and political independence, as well as freedom of states to choose their own security arrangements. The Nordic and Baltic countries stand in full solidarity with Ukraine, supporting its territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. Russia has a clear and direct responsibility under international law to work to find a peaceful settlement of the conflict. We call on Russia to respect the principles of the UN Charter, to de-escalate, and to choose to engage in the meaningful diplomacy. Mr. President, in 3 days, we will mark the 8th anniversary of the illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. The Nordic and Baltic countries continue to condemn this blatant violation of international law and remain committed to implementing the EU's non-recognition policy, including through restrictive measures. We call on UN member states to consider similar measures in accordance with the UN General Assembly, the Resolution 68/262. We continue to condemn the increasing militarization of the Crimean Peninsula and the severe deterioration of the human rights situation there. We recall the obligation of all states not to recognize as lawful any territorial acquisition or special advantage resulting from the use of armed forces. The Russia-instigated conflict has resulted in around 14,000 deaths, 1.5 million displaced, countless damages and suffering of those living on both sides of the contact line. Furthermore, we are witnessing Russia's continued effort of de facto integration and systematic demographic changes of the illegally annexed Crimea, as well as non-government controlled areas in Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, including through accelerated issuing of Russian passports on the massive scale to Ukrainian citizens and forced conscription to the Russian armed forces. Such moves are making the conflict resolution efforts even more difficult. We are concerned about reported arbitrary detentions and arrests, especially of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian-speaking minorities, increasing pressure on journalists and media workers, human rights defenders, and other members of civil society. Russia must fully respect international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We call for the immediate release of all illegally detained and imprisoned persons in the Crimean Peninsula and in Russia. It is essential that international organizations and human rights actors have unhindered access to the areas currently not under control of the Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, in accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 76/179 of the 16th December 2021. We urge Russia to withdraw its forces and materiel from within Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula and non-government controlled areas of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, as well as from areas adjacent to its borders, and to immediately stop fueling the conflict. We reiterate our full support to the efforts towards peaceful and sustainable resolution of this conflict through the established international mechanisms. We commend Ukraine for its constructive approach and urge Russia to assume its responsibility as a party to the conflict, upholding its commitments, abide by the international law, and return to the discussions within the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. It is essential that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission have free and unhindered access through Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula and non-government controlled areas in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine, in accordance with its mandates. We're deeply concerned regarding the continued restrictions of the mission's freedom of movement, including security incidents involving its staff and assets. Mr. President, the position of Nordic and Baltic countries is clear. It is our duty as members of the UN to defend the rules-based international order. Challenges to this order clearly affect international community as a whole. We urge Russia to abide by international law and uphold its international commitments. Like the Secretary General, we recall the obligations under the UN Charter of all members to refrain from the threat or use of force and to settle the international disputes by peaceful means. We thank the Secretary General for his clear message on Russia's aggressive actions and call for the UN to continue efforts to restore respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and unity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lithuania, who spoke on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
господин председатель, господин генеральный секретарь. Начать свое выступление хотел бы с уточнения. Пункт повестки дня, по которому мы сегодня встречаемся, явно назван некорректно. И если он и должен отражать реальность, то речь нужно вести не о временно оккупированных территориях, а о территориях, потерянных в результате человека ненавистнической политики по отношению к собственным гражданам, которую Киев сделал национальной идеей после нелегитимного майданного переворота в 2014 году. По отношению особенно к тем гражданам, кто высказал несогласие с этим переворотом. С момента прихода к власти нынешний режим при молчаливом покровительстве западных кураторов занялся системным ущемлением базовых прав человека, в том числе по национальному признаку. Понимаем, что в центре сегодняшней дискуссии окажется признание Российской Федерации Донецкой и Луганской народных республик как актуальный новостной сюжет. Вокруг этого решения сейчас много спекуляций и инсинуаций. Хочу подчеркнуть, что произошедшее стало прямым следствием многолетнего саботажа Киевом своих прямых обязательств по комплексу мер, одобренному резолюцией Совета Безопасности 2202. С момента ее принятия в феврале 2015 года Россия была последовательно привержена этому непростому внутриукраинскому компромиссу. Мы делали все для сохранения суверенитета и территориальной целостности Украины, организовали множество заседаний Совета Безопасности ООН, встреч по формуле Ария, заинтересованно участвовали в работе нормандского формата и контактной группы в Минске, обсуждали ситуацию на востоке Украины в Организации по безопасности и сотрудничеству в Европе. И это при том, что стороной Минского процесса Россия не являлась и не является. Но все было тщетно. 8 лет Киев продолжал и продолжает бомбить своих же граждан и уклоняться от прямого диалога с Донбассом, а все мировое сообщество все эти 8 лет Киев водил за нос, уверяя в приверженности Минским соглашениям и готовности их выполнять, только в своей интерпретации. И, по сути, саботировал работу контактной группы в Минске, ведь большинство из вас даже не представляет себе, как проходили заседания контактной группы, и как украинские представители саботировали принятие решений не только по политическим, но и по экономическим и по гуманитарным вопросам. Однако в последнее время украинские руководители перестали стесняться и прямо на камеры заявили о том, что не собираются выполнять свои обязательства. Наверное, последним подтверждением этому стал тот факт, что украинский поспред недвусмысленно подтвердил такой настрой в ходе организованной нами встречи Совета Безопасности 17 февраля. А наши западные коллеги Украину к выполнению Минска даже не призывали. Стало очевидно, что никаких перспектив выполнения этого документа Киевом больше нет. Именно из-за нежелания Киева учитывать интересы широких слоев населения, Украина с 2014 года находится в состоянии войны со своими гражданами, не согласными с ценностями Майдана и нынешней политикой украинских властей. А западные покровители Украины ничего не сделали, чтобы убедить Киев услышать собственный народ, проявляя при этом вопиющие двойные стандарты. В любой другой кризисной ситуации государства-члены ООН призывают к инклюзивному, прямому диалогу конфликтующих сторон. В противном случае внутренний конфликт не подлежит урегулированию. Однако в случае на Украине все было с точностью да наоборот. Краеугольный камень комплекса мер, прямой диалог между Киевом и Донбассом, саботировался Киевом все это время. К нашему сожалению, генеральный секретарь ООН сделал на днях и сегодня несколько высказываний по поводу происходящего на востоке Украины, которые не соответствуют его статусу и его полномочиям по уставу ООН. Мы специально посмотрели статистику, прошлые файлы, досье и обнаружили, что не было ни одного конфликта, когда генеральный секретарь, будь то нынешний или его предшественники, позволял себе подобные высказывания в отношении любой страны. По ситуации на Украине генеральный секретарь ни разу не возвысил свой голос в пользу необходимости выполнения тех требований Минского комплекса мер резолюции 2202 Совета Безопасности, которые прямо требуют решать все проблемы по согласованию между Киевом, Донецком и Луганском. Об этом никто и на Западе ни разу не упомянул. И, к сожалению, генеральный секретарь последовал этому печальному примеру. В этих условиях нам непонятно, какие добрые услуги, о которых говорил генеральный секретарь, он может предоставить. Крымчане, дончане и луганчане еще в 2014 году объявили о независимости. Крыму повезло больше. Его жители почти сразу же высказались в пользу присоединения к России и оказались под защитой Российской Федерации. Дончанам и луганчанам, которые наши немецкие и французские партнеры пообещали справедливое урегулирование, пришлось ждать нашего признания долгих 8 лет, в течение которых все еще теплилась надежда на то, что Киев одумается и начнет диалог со своими гражданами. Однако майданная власть подобных планов не имела и за эти годы осуществила две чудовищные и кровавые военные авантюры, закончившиеся разгромом украинской армии ополченцами и подписанием Минских соглашений. Вместо их выполнения Киев с самого начала вынашивал план реванша, не прекращая обстрелов мирных кварталов и диверсий. Кроме того, важно учитывать, что за эти годы Украина прочно превратилась в антироссию и возвела борьбу с русским языком и всем русским в ранг государственной политики. В стране появилась языковая инквизиция. Сфера употребления русского языка неуклонно сжималась, подвергалась репрессиям. Уже при президенте Зеленском, который в ходе предвыборной кампании рядился в одежде миротворца и защитника интересов всех украинцев, было запрещено вещание 6 оппозиционных каналов. Активно насаждалась и насаждается ложь о Второй мировой войне. Соратники Гитлера становились героями, а настоящие герои предавались забвению. Несогласные с такой политикой Киева преследовались, подвергались репрессиям, судебным преследованиям и физическим расправам, включая убийство оппозиционных политиков и журналистов. Таким образом, дончанам и луганчанам было очевидно, в какую Украину им предлагают вернуться. Однако даже перед лицом этого они не уходили от выполнения Минских соглашений, веря в то, что документ будет выполнен и у них появится особый статус. Как оказалось, этим надеждам не суждено было сбыться. Сегодня всем известна чудовищная цифра в 14 тысяч жертв этого конфликта, среди которых сотни детей. Подавляющее большинство из них – это жители Донецка и Луганска. Все эти годы против Донбасса действует экономическая, транспортная и продовольственная блокада. Пожилые люди и дети прячутся от обстрелов по подвалам. Счет беженцев, которые спасаются в России, обратите внимание, в России, а не на Украине, только в последние дни идет на десятки тысяч, а конкретно сегодня их 96 тысяч человек. Для любого цивилизованного государства очевидно, что так со своим народом не поступают. А значит, Киеву нужны не донбассы, а только их земля. Об этом прямо говорил президент Зеленский, предложив донбассам убираться в Россию. И при этом киевская власть именует этих людей, презрительно именует этих людей террористами. Убедившись в безнадежности ситуации, мы приняли решение о том, что народ Донбасса имеет право считать себя независимым. Остальное вам известно. Уважаемые коллеги, в условиях неприкрытого геноцида и попрания главного права человека, права на жизнь, наша страна не могла более оставаться безучастной к судьбе 4-миллионного Донбасса. Мы руководствовались прежде всего тем, что высшая ценность – это человеческая жизнь. Критикуя нас за это решение, вы проявляете полное безразличие к судьбе дончан и луганчан, как это делали Киев и его западные кураторы все 8 лет конфликта. И этот конфликт далеко не исчерпан. Обстрелы мирных кварталов обеих республик не прекратились. Запад продолжает наускивать, подбадривать и вооружать Киев. Предупреждаем, что в условиях, когда по просьбе Донецка и Луганска следить за режимом прекращения огня будут вооруженные силы России, либеральничать с нарушителями никто не станет. Поэтому призываю вас сегодня сосредоточить усилия на том, чтобы утихомирить Киев и удержать его от новых военных авантюр, которые могут дорого обойтись для нынешней украинской власти. Благодарю вас.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Mr. President, the government of Japan has a strong view that what is happening in and around Ukraine is not an isolated problem in Europe, but a problem for the entire international community and a challenge to the international order. It goes totally against the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Japan consistently supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia's decision to recognize the independence of certain regions of eastern Ukraine seriously undermines those very principles in violation of international law. It is absolutely unacceptable, and Japan strongly condemns the series of recent Russian acts. Prime Minister Kishida, acting in lockstep with the international community, has announced sanction measures, including the suspension of the issuance of entry visas and asset freeze to individuals concerned. Japan continues to pay close attention with serious concern to the development of the situation, including Russia's military buildup in the armed areas around Ukraine's borders, and its decision regarding the deployment of its forces outside its territory. Tensions should be de-escalated by the withdrawal of Russian troops, and this is essential to restore the cause of diplomacy. Any threat or use of force against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states goes against the fundamental principles that underpin the rules-based international order. It is a clear violation of international law, and what is at stake for the member states is the rule of law and the UN Charter itself. Mr. President, Japan expresses its solidarity with the people of Ukraine for the hope come true. Japan has made its own diplomatic efforts for a peaceful solution and supports the efforts of all countries for a serious diplomatic solution to the present crisis. Before closing, let me reiterate that unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion are unacceptable, regardless of wherever they take place. No member state can afford to be a bystander. Japan will continue to work hand in hand with other partners. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Member states of the United Nations, we stand at a crossroads in the history of this body. On Monday, President Putin announced that Russia would recognize as independent states the so-called DNR and LNR regions, part of the sovereign territory of Ukraine, controlled by Russia's proxies since 2014. He then ordered Russian military forces, under the guise of so-called peacekeepers, to deploy to these regions. In the hours that followed, Secretary General Guterres said this was a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. He reaffirmed that to us in his remarks today. In an emergency meeting Monday night, all but one member of the Security Council called for dialogue and diplomacy, which can only happen if Russia abandons its unprovoked further aggression toward Ukraine. Has Russia heeded these calls? No. Instead, it has responded with additional actions to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, including mass disinformation, which we just heard again today, cyber attacks, and efforts to create a false flag pretext, in addition to Russia's overwhelming military buildup of more than 150,000 troops near Ukraine's border. Russia's actions have only confirmed what we and other nations have been warning about. Other UN member states must recognize the threat before us all today, before it's too late. Colleagues, there's no middle ground here. Calling for both sides to de-escalate only gives Russia a pass. Russia is the aggressor here. History tells us that looking the other way is ultimately the more costly path. And we need only to look across the past decade for an indication of the path that Russia is taking. Since 2014, Russia has occupied Crimea following its illegal invasion and has been manufacturing and fueling ongoing military conflicts in eastern Ukraine. In recent years, including President Putin's remarks this week, Russian leaders have claimed that Ukraine is not a real country. They have questioned its right to exist. Russia's actions are an unprovoked violation of international law, of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a direct contradiction of the Minsk agreements. Russia's aggression not only threatens all of Ukraine, but every member state and the UN itself. Colleagues, President Putin gave us the clearest indication of his intentions on Monday when he asked the world to travel back in time by more than 100 years before the United Nations even existed to an age of empires. He asserted that Russia can recolonize its neighbors and that he will use force to make a farce of the United Nations. The United States rejects that firmly. This is 2022. We're not going back to an era of empires and colonies or to the USSR or the Soviet Union. We have moved forward, and we must ensure, as the permanent representative from Kenya said in the Security Council on Monday night, that the embers of dead empires do not ignite new forms of oppression and violence. Unfortunately, the fake reality Russia wants to create is already having real consequences for the people of Ukraine and for the world. To date, Russia's war in eastern Ukraine has already killed more than 14,000 people. Nearly 3 million Ukrainians, half of whom are elderly people and children, need food, shelter, and other life-saving assistance. And of course, ordinary Russians should be asking how many Russian lives Putin is willing to sacrifice to feed his ambitions. If Russia continues down this path, it could, according to our estimates, create a new refugee crisis, one of the largest facing the world today, with as many as 5 million more people displaced by Russia's war of choice and putting pressure on Ukraine's neighbors. And because Ukraine is one of the world's largest wheat suppliers, especially for the developing world, Russia's actions could cause a spike in food prices and lead to even more desperate hunger in places like Libya, Yemen, and Lebanon. The tidal wave of suffering this war will cause are unthinkable. And then there's the broader threat that Russia's actions upend our international system, make a mockery of the UN Charter, and call into question our most fundamental principles of sovereignty, diplomacy, and territorial integrity. Unfortunately, despite these terrible world-altering outcomes, Russia appears determined to proceed. Together with our partners and allies, President Biden has taken decisive action to make the cost of Russia's actions crystal clear. But as much as we all want Russia to de-escalate and choose the path of peace, that is not our choice to make. This is President Putin's war of choice. If he chooses to escalate further, Russia and Russia alone will bear full responsibility for what is to come. What we can do together today is make clear that Russia will pay an even steeper price if it continues this aggression, that responsible countries do not bully their neighbors into submission, that former empires cannot lay claim to sovereign and independent nations. The very first line of the UN Charter states, "We are uniting together," quote, "determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." This, right here, right now, is a moment. It is a moment when we can save this generation and the next from that terrible fate. Colleagues, now is not the time to sit on the sidelines. Now is the time to get off of the sidelines. Let us together show Russia that it is isolated and alone in its aggressive actions. Let us stand fully behind the principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity for Ukraine and for all member states. Let us show Russia that every other UN member state believes it is time to de-escalate, to come back to the negotiating table, and to work toward peace so that Ukrainians can live in security and the tenets of the UN Charter can be upheld for future generations to come. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Georgia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, my delegation aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union, and in my national capacity, I would like to add the following comment. Last year, we celebrated 75th anniversary of the United Nations, which was created to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But today, our generation and this very United Nations and the rules-based order has come at a crucial juncture. How the events will unfold will define not only the future of security and stability in Europe, but of the entire international community. It is deeply alarming that the international norms and principles that we all committed to uphold are repeatedly violated by the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council whose primary responsibility is to do the exact opposite, act as the guardian of peace and security. Unfortunately, breaching the international law and undermining international rules-based order has long been a marking of Russia's aggressive policy towards its neighboring states, aimed at forcefully redrawing their borders and trying to curb their sovereign choices. My country, Georgia, is no exception here. Russia's decision to recognize the so-called independence of integral parts of Ukraine and sending its military as the so-called peacekeepers represent grave violation of the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. Moreover, they are in breach of Russia's own commitments made under the Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk Agreements endorsed by the Security Council Resolution 2202. The Georgian government strongly condemns Russia's so-called recognition of Ukraine's territories, the so-called LPR and DPR. Let me be clear, these decisions, as in the case of Russian-occupied Georgian regions, shall never be accepted by the international community. 8 years have passed since the Russian aggression against Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, and instigation of the conflict in Donbass. The humanitarian cost alone is tremendous. More than 14,000 Ukrainian citizens died, while more than 30,000 have been injured, and almost 1.5 million residents of the occupied areas of Ukraine now live in internal displacement. As we speak, another wave of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine is well underway. It is aimed at redrawing Ukraine's sovereign borders, and the security repercussions of such actions will go far beyond Ukraine. Let me express strong solidarity and commend brave Ukrainian people for their restraint and resilience in the face of the ongoing aggression. Dear colleagues, aggression against Ukraine is a repetition of the same pattern of Russia's illegal actions that we saw against my own country. It started with inciting and backing up puppet regimes in Georgia's Abkhazia and Tskhinvali regions. Then came a full-scale military aggression in 2008 under fabricated pretexts, leading to their illegal occupation. And shortly after signing a ceasefire agreement, instead of fulfilling obligations undertaken, Russia recognized the occupied territories as sovereign entities, thus creating a launchpad for their factual annexation. As of today, in breach of all the international commitments, including inter alia the EU-mediated 12th of August 2008 ceasefire agreement, Russian Federation continues its illegal and provocative actions toward the occupied regions of Georgia, conducting so-called borderization process, which in effect is nothing less than a continuous aggression and a creeping annexation. Humanitarian consequences of the aforementioned actions are appalling, given unbearable human rights situation and the conditions the civilian population, women and children have to endure. We are seeing the very same playbook in action in Ukraine. This pattern of behavior brazenly undermines the entire international rules-based order, poses grave threat to regional and global peace and security, and are inconsistent with the ways how responsible states should act in the 21st century. It is no longer about Ukraine or Georgia or other countries neighboring Russia. Peace and security in Europe and beyond are at stake. Silence and acquiescence to land grabbing today is tantamount to a crime before the generations to come. Distinguished colleagues, we should be united in defending the very fundamentals of the international rules-based order, and first and foremost, the UN Charter, Helsinki Final Act, and Charter of Paris for New Europe. With this in mind, we call on Russia to reverse its illegal recognition, to immediately withdraw its military from Ukraine and its borders, and abide by the international law. We call upon Russia to do the same with regard to the occupied Georgian regions. And in conclusion, Georgia strongly supports Ukraine's European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations and reiterates its unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and Donbass, and Ukraine's navigational rights in its territorial waters. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Georgia, and now I invite the distinguished representative of Turkey to take the floor.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, it has been 8 years since the occupation of Crimea. Since the first day, the international community has maintained a resolute position. We never recognized the illegal annexation. And we have always supported Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political unity within its internationally recognized borders. This is our legal and moral obligation. Mr. President, today we face a new act of aggression, this time against another part of Ukrainian territory. This is totally unacceptable. We reject Russia's decision to recognize the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk republics and send in additional troops. It is illegal and illegitimate. It is in contravention of the Minsk agreements and constitutes a flagrant violation of Ukraine's political unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, we do not need, nor do we want, a new war in our region. We call upon Russia to reverse its decision and return to diplomacy and dialogue on the basis of the Minsk agreements. This is the only way that will take us away from the precipice. Therefore, we call for restraint and common sense. We urge the parties to get together around the negotiation table without delay. As a neighbor to both parties, we are ready to facilitate this process and host technical and/or high-level meetings. We also welcome President Zelensky's proposal for a meeting between P5, Turkey, Germany, and Ukraine. Finally, we continue to support the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission led by Ambassador Halit Çevik. Mr. President, I am obliged to repeat, today Ukraine, a founding member of the United Nations, is faced with yet another act of aggression, and the global community is faced with yet another threat to regional and international peace and security. But above all, this is an aggression against the fundamental principles of international law and the UN Charter. Make no mistake, we all need the rules-based international order. It is our duty as member states to defend legality. It is our obligation to ensure that conflicts are resolved through peaceful means. We must make sure that the founding principles of the UN are upheld. This is the only way to save ourselves from the scourge of war. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. And I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Señor Presidente, señor Secretario General, una vez más, otra grave crisis con peligrosas repercusiones mundiales vuelve a tocar las puertas de Europa del Este y de nuestra organización. Al reconocer las regiones del Donetsk y del Luhansk como entidades independientes, la Federación de Rusia viola la soberanía y la integridad territorial de Ucrania. Transgrede la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, los acuerdos de Minsk y el Memorándum de Budapest, así como reiteradas resoluciones del Consejo de Seguridad y de esta Asamblea General, y muchos de los principios más sólidos del derecho internacional. Costa Rica condena tales acciones contrarias al derecho internacional y reitera que los hechos consumados, si bien pueden imponer realidades sobre el terreno, no generan derechos. Permítanme hacer 4 reflexiones sobre la crisis actual. En primer lugar, debemos aceptar que la seguridad colectiva, para ser legítima, debe respetar el derecho internacional. La Carta de esta organización define claramente nuestros derechos y nuestros deberes. Su cumplimiento no es opcional, es obligatorio, porque incluso las naciones más grandes están sujetas a ese derecho internacional. Es obligatorio porque los miembros no electos del Consejo de Seguridad han de ser actores internacionales ejemplares, pues a ellos se les confía la paz y la seguridad en nombre del resto de la membresía. Como miembros no electos, tienen más obligaciones con el derecho internacional y con su respeto irrestricto. En segundo lugar, la agresión rusa y la violación de la soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania y la violación de los términos que hicieron posible la entrega de armas nucleares por parte de ese país socavan el régimen internacional de la no proliferación. Con el memorándum de Budapest, los estados dueños de armas nucleares se comprometieron a respetar las fronteras de Ucrania a cambio de la renuncia de ella a las armas nucleares. Costa Rica lamenta el incumplimiento de este compromiso que conlleva graves consecuencias para el régimen de la no proliferación nuclear. Esto es motivo de preocupación para toda la comunidad internacional y en particular para los países que, como los de nuestra América Latina y el Caribe, hemos declarado ser libres de armas nucleares. Un Estado es tan fuerte como su palabra. En tercer lugar, señor presidente, señor secretario general, debemos agotar todas las vías diplomáticas para evitar las devastadoras consecuencias humanitarias de un conflicto armado para millones de personas en Ucrania. Los espacios cívicos y las libertades fundamentales en las regiones del Donetsk y del Luhansk se han visto gravemente reducidos desde los graves hechos armados que tuvieron lugar en el año 2014. Y ello ha provocado una erosión de la libertad de expresión y del activismo independiente. Costa Rica lamenta que muchos defensores de los derechos humanos, de los que he sido uno, muchos activistas medioambientales, periodistas y miembros de minorías nacionales se hayan visto obligados a huir, y ello ha restringido su participación en asuntos públicos y en asambleas pacíficas. No hay allí libertad ni pluralidad porque hay censura y persecución. La comunidad internacional, señor presidente, debe mantener un registro diligente de todas las violaciones del derecho internacional, de los derechos humanos y del derecho internacional humanitario por parte de la Federación de Rusia, en línea con lo manifestado aquí por el señor secretario general. Como hemos visto en esta crisis, las tecnologías emergentes ofrecen un nuevo conjunto de retos y un potencial de escalada de conflictos que requieren de respuestas diplomáticas. La capacidad de algunos estados de emplear la inteligencia artificial en los ciberataques y en las campañas de desinformación hacen más urgente que nunca adoptar nuevos acuerdos multilaterales para minimizar los riesgos futuros y garantizar la estabilidad internacional. No permitamos que se haga del hábitat de millones de personas en Ucrania un campo experimental de nuevas y cruentas formas de violencia masiva. Ya esos tiempos pasaron. Y para que quede claro, cortar las redes eléctricas es violencia. La guerra psicológica es violencia. Una violencia que debe ser condenada con el mismo vigor que aplicamos a la violencia armada. La ley protege a los civiles sin importar el medio de sufrimiento. Y Costa Rica seguirá honrando el derecho de los civiles ucranianos a una vida cotidiana pacífica y segura, sin injerencia extranjera. Para terminar, señor presidente, Costa Rica quiere recordar que a todos los estados que el camino hacia la construcción de la paz debe estar pavimentado con iniciativas centradas en las personas y lideradas por mujeres. Lejos de ser víctimas indefensas, las mujeres han estado en primera línea, llamando al cese de combates, abordando las causas profundas de los conflictos y han estado también presentes en la construcción de la paz. La paz no será sostenible si no es inclusiva. Señor presidente, nuestras Naciones Unidas deben ser mucho más que un lugar que obligue a los estados a deponer las armas. Las Naciones Unidas deben ser un lugar en donde prevalezca el diálogo y nadie sienta la necesidad de levantar las armas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Señor presidente, señor secretario general, México acude a esta sesión dedicada a la situación en Ucrania con el ánimo de contribuir a mantener abiertas las vías del diálogo y de la diplomacia. La posición de México tiene como fundamento la obligación de respetar la soberanía, la unidad y la integridad territorial de Ucrania dentro de sus fronteras reconocidas internacionalmente, en apego irrestricto al derecho internacional, a la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y a las resoluciones 2625, 3314 y 68/262 de esta Asamblea General, así como a los acuerdos de Minsk. Observamos que el efecto acumulado de los hechos registrados en los últimos días violenta tres principios fundamentales: la proscripción de la amenaza o el uso de la fuerza en las relaciones internacionales, el respeto de la integridad territorial e independencia política de los estados y la no intervención en los asuntos internos de los estados. Señor presidente, ante el Consejo de Seguridad, hace apenas unos días, Rusia hizo una declaración en el sentido de que no invadiría Ucrania. Esperamos que mantenga su cabal cumplimiento. México coincide con las declaraciones del secretario general y respalda su llamado a una solución pacífica. La resolución 2202 de 2015 del Consejo de Seguridad, adoptada por unanimidad, constituye el único marco para resolver la situación en el este de Ucrania. Las Naciones Unidas han creado el más amplio andamiaje de mecanismos de solución pacífica de las controversias, y tales mecanismos no están agotados. En el Consejo de Seguridad, México compartió su visión para revertir las tensiones, fomentar el diálogo y brindar espacio a la negociación política mediante 3 elementos: la distensión, la diplomacia y el diálogo. Finalmente, reiteramos nuestro llamado a que las partes faciliten el acceso humanitario de manera segura e irrestricta y se respeten plenamente los derechos humanos de toda la población. Señor presidente, son situaciones como estas o como esta las que ponen a prueba la capacidad de la organización para cumplir con sus principios y propósitos. Es momento de cumplir con nuestro mandato. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, la France condamne fermement la reconnaissance unilatérale par la Russie de l'indépendance des régions séparatistes de l'Est de l'Ukraine. Elle condamne aussi la décision de déployer l'armée russe dans ces territoires. Il s'agit d'une violation du droit international. Il s'agit d'une violation de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, incompatible avec la Charte des Nations Unies, comme le secrétaire général l'a déclaré. Il s'agit d'un renoncement unilatéral de la Russie aux accords de Minsk, qu'elle avait pourtant signés et qui sont endossés par la résolution 2202 du Conseil de sécurité. Il s'agit également d'une violation claire des principes fondamentaux de l'OSCE consacrés dans l'acte final d'Helsinki et la Charte de Paris, et sur lesquels repose la stabilité en Europe. Il s'agit enfin d'une remise en cause des engagements pris par le président Poutine au cours des derniers jours. La France est gravement préoccupée par la remise en cause de la légitimité de l'existence même de l'État ukrainien par les plus hautes autorités de l'État russe. La Russie a choisi la voie de la déstabilisation et de la confrontation en dépit des efforts incessants en faveur de la désescalade au cours des dernières semaines et des derniers jours, notamment de la part du président Macron en lien avec le chancelier Scholz. Nous appelons la Russie à revenir sur la décision de reconnaissance des entités séparatistes et à retirer ses forces de l'ensemble du territoire de l'Ukraine dans ses frontières internationalement reconnues. D'ici là, la France et ses partenaires de l'Union européenne prennent les mesures qui s'imposent, notamment contre les banques qui financent les opérations militaires russes dans ces territoires et pour prévenir le commerce avec les entités séparatistes. Dans le contexte des tensions élevées aux frontières de l'Ukraine provoquées par le renforcement de l'activité militaire russe et la multiplication des violations du cessez-le-feu le long de la ligne de contact ces derniers jours, cette nouvelle étape de déstabilisation de la part de la Russie fait peser une grave menace sur la sécurité européenne. Nous appelons la Russie à s'abstenir de toutes actions de déstabilisation supplémentaires, notamment celles susceptibles de mettre en danger la sécurité des populations civiles. Nous condamnons l'usage d'armes lourdes et les bombardements indiscriminés de zones civiles qui constituent là encore des violations claires des accords de Minsk. La France salue la retenue dont l'Ukraine a fait preuve dans ces circonstances difficiles. Elle exprime toute sa solidarité avec le peuple et le gouvernement ukrainien. La France rappelle
utilize these instruments available to them. One of them is the significant increase of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine under the circumstances. Second, we reminded the United Nations about our request of 2015 to consider launching a peace operation in Ukraine. And there is a way to do that without the UN Security Council decision based on the UN General Assembly resolution. So I'm certain that if there is a will, there is a way. And we will be working with the United Nations on making sure that the will is there and we find the way to put pressure on Russia.
Minister, you got to talks with Americans yesterday. You met Secretary Blinken, you met President Biden. You never comment on that until now. Could you tell what is the main message you got from Americans?
The not even both, but my three main counterparts, my three main interlocutors in Washington, President Biden, State Secretary Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin, they all conveyed three very clear messages. First, the United States will stand by Ukraine, whatever happens, whatever scenario Russia will prefer. Second, the United States will continue to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons to further build our capacity to defend our country. And I would like to assure you that we would be happy if we never have to pick up those weapons and use them in the battlefield. We want peace. But if Russia attacks, we have to be equipped to fight back. And the third message was that US sanctions will be continued. There will be more sanctions on Russia, more painful sanctions on Russia, and they will be done in close coordination with the allies, with the US allies in Europe and other parts of the world in order to ensure the maximum efficiency of these sanctions. So these are the political messages, but I assure you that in our talks we were very specific about the ways how these messages will be turned into actions in the coming days. And we appreciate, for example, the sanctions which were already imposed by the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, the European Union, some other countries, but this is not enough. And our partners should not wait for Russian rockets to hit Ukrainian soil or Russian planes to cross into our airspace to impose the new wave of sanctions. Sanctions make sense when they deter Russia from further action. So the time for the next wave of sanctions has come. We are in a very dynamic situation and every day matters.
Thank you, Stefano Vaccara, Voce di New York. This is a follow-up and another question. So can we say that you, after the meeting in Washington, you are satisfied, completely satisfied? Because there were reactions in Washington by the other party that say that President Biden was too weak in his reaction toward Russia. So I would like you to respond to this. And then today, what you heard so far, the speeches, there will be more, China will speak. Are you satisfied, the reaction? Is Russia isolated enough in this building at the moment?
I will be satisfied when the last Russian soldier withdraws from Ukrainian territory. Until it doesn't happen, I cannot be fully satisfied. But what we saw yesterday and the day before in Washington, in London, in Brussels, in Ottawa, was a clear demonstration that, that our partners understand clearly one simple fact. This is not only an attack on Ukraine. This is an attack on the existing world order. And the fact that they imposed the first wave of sanctions is appreciated. The decision of the German government to hold Nord Stream 2 is appreciated, but this is not enough to stop Putin. And this is why the message that I received yesterday in Washington, that what was already done is not the end of story, and more actions will be taken. And we will be looking forward to it. And my message is simple, that do not wait too long. You have to act now. Literally every day, decisions have to be adopted. More sanctions have to be imposed. More weapons have to be supplied. More diplomatic efforts have to be undertaken.
Mr. Minister, I would like to come back to UN topic actually, because since we're here. You already mentioned about the tools, practical tools that can be implemented by UN to help Ukraine. Can you be more specific about deadlines, about conditions when we can talk about, like, for example, strengths of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, or like peacekeeping missions that actually everybody is expected to see? Thank you.
Again, deadline for every action aimed at preventing the war is now. We all have our bureaucracies, national governments, international organizations. They are essentially bureaucratic structures, and we understand that there are procedures. So the sooner these procedures are launched, the better it is. The situation deteriorates every day, and no one can allow waiting until it's too late. As foreign minister, I do my best to avoid a situation when the world reacts to the war only after Ukrainian blood will be spilled. I do not want my compatriots to pay their lives and sufferings for the reluctance, for the cautiousness, for the inability to act by other governments or international organizations. This is why I'm saying clearly here in the United Nations, and I said it yesterday in Washington, we appreciate what has been done, but this is not enough. More needs to be done as soon as possible.
Foreign Minister, thank you so much for this availability. My question goes to the message that the Russian ambassador gave. At the end of his speech, he said that the Russian military will be in charge of peacekeeping, and they will not be softy with the violators. What can you say about that type of message, especially after the Secretary General was very clear about his concern of the use of the word peacekeeping to refer to the Russian military on the Donbas area?
I think the Secretary General should come out and say a very simple thing. Russia must stop abusing the word peacekeepers and the concept of peacekeeping enshrined in the United Nations Charter. This is exactly what we are talking about. Russia tries to replace the UN with itself. They want to have a free hand to decide how to maintain peace, the way they want to maintain peace. And usually when they say that we want to maintain peace, they speak about another act of aggression. And the use of the word peacekeepers may work for Russian audience, but it shouldn't mislead the world. And the world should clearly debunk this disinformation and speak openly. This is the time to call spade a spade. Speaking about classic diplomatic narratives do not work anymore. Calling on both sides to de-escalate or making statements not mentioning Russia doesn't help anyone except Russia, because it creates space for Russia to move forward and to come to a conclusion that in the end everything will be fine. Because if they are afraid to call us by name now, under these critical circumstances, then they will tolerate any kind of behavior. But again, I will repeat it. The fact that you mentioned about the reference to peacekeepers, it's another manifestation of Russia's ignorance, of Russia ignoring the United Nations, of Russia attacking the fundamental concepts of the United Nations. And I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that what Russia is doing now is an attempt to make the United Nations follow the path of the League of Nations. We all saw it in history. And it's for our generation who learned history, who read history books, who know diplomacy, to avoid the repetition of this scenario. No one can say now, this has never happened before. We didn't realize where it would take us to. There will be no such excuse. Everyone perfectly understands what is happening here. And the attack on the Secretary General by the Russian ambassador is unprecedented. And if the United Nations tolerate such an attack, it will be only the United Nations who will suffer the most and who will end up discredited and unrespected.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister, and thank you for this availability, and welcome to New York. There has been a lot of concern about how President Biden described the invasion by Russia, calling it the start of an invasion. Just to follow up to what you mentioned, did you talk to him about how he might have moved the goalpost in imposing sanctions on Russia, how for months he threatened to impose those hard-hitting sanctions, and now there is talk that perhaps throwing Russia out of the SWIFT financial system might be out of the question. That was the nuclear option. And my second question is, after what you heard from the Russians today at the United Nations General Assembly, under what circumstance would you sit down at the same table with your Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, for some kind of negotiation about this matter? Thank you.
As far as I understand President Biden, his idea is to impose sanctions by waves. And we accept this approach. But what I said to the President yesterday, what I said to other interlocutors and during my meetings here in the United Nations, is that these waves should come one after another. Again, we appreciate decisions already taken, but they're not enough to prevent Russia from changing their mind, to prevent President Putin from changing their mind. This is not enough. And we should not allow Russia the slightest possibility to think that the unbearable sanctions which were promised to them will be bearable. Now, on Minister Lavrov, I was appointed as foreign minister in March 2020, and since then there were numerous attempts to arrange our meeting in Normandy format. I reach out to speak bilaterally on the phone to him, but he never picks up the phone. He never agrees he never agreed to meet in the Normandy format. He is talented enough to find all kinds of excuses why he shouldn't show up. So I don't care about him. If he is ready to convince President Putin to stop this madness, we are ready to sit down. I'm open. If he just follows if he just reinforces the narratives of President Putin and chooses war to diplomacy, that's his choice. That's his choice. And he will pay for that.
Hello, I'm Kaori Yoshida from Nikkei, Japanese business news. Japan, along with some Western nations, have imposed sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. There are a lot of Japanese media here today. Could we get a reaction from you on these movements and for the announcement of potential additional sanctions by Japan?
We expect a stronger reaction by Japan and a stronger action by Japan for a number of reasons which I'm not going to elaborate on today. I believe Japan must be vitally interested in not allowing Russia to crush the existing world order based on rules, and not to demonstrate by its example to others that this is a path of success. And the one who dares eventually succeeds. And these are the global consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Because if we are not able to defend very simple fundamental principles in Europe, it means that we are not able to defend them in any other part of the world. So a stronger reaction by Japan is most welcome. And I understand that some countries may think this is not our fight. We have to wait and see how it ends up. Some believe that we have excellent relations with Russia. Why should we put them at stake? But this is not about Ukraine. This is really about the destruction of the world order. And every nation who has this kind of considerations should understand simple fact. Now Russia tries to behave nicely to them, to keep them under control and avoid additional pressure coming from new corners. But if Russia succeeds, the next step for Russia will be to build their relations with those countries from a dominant position, because they will demonstrate that this is what we are capable to do, and this is where we are capable, we can be successful. So every country should be mindful of that consequence. Russia may smile to you today, like they did with Minsk agreements. For 7 years they were convincing everyone that Minsk agreements is the only and fundamental basis for diplomatic solution. They were saying on every corner that Minsk agreements were endorsed by the UN Security Council resolution. This is a sacred document that everyone has to focus on. But one morning they changed their plan and they abandoned everything. It's crazy. A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council killed the document endorsed by the United Nations Security Council resolution, which they supported and had been convincing everyone to follow it. So the mood, the attitude can change in a day, and every country should understand that. Every country should understand that making compromises comes at a price to all. Thank you. Have a good day. Stay safe.
Ahora sí, como debe ser.
Millions d'Ukrainiens. De nombreux autres Ukrainiens ont besoin d'aide humanitaire. Nous sommes maintenant sur le seuil d'une situation encore plus dévastatrice et malgré ces dénégations, sa campagne de désinformation, ses fabrications, ses mensonges et sa propagande, la Russie doit accepter la responsabilité des pertes des vies humaines, de la destruction de la paix et du chaos qu'elle a créé. We strongly condemn the recognition by Russia of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and its decision to move troops into Ukraine under what they call peacekeeping, but anyone else who understands the meaning of language would call war-making. They're not peacekeepers. They're soldiers who are there to invade. Their actions violate several treaties and international agreements to which Russia is a signatory, including the Budapest Accords, the Minsk Agreements, and of course the Charter. These come with obligations that Russia is clearly rejecting. As demonstrated today, Canada and the international community are united and steadfast in our support for Ukraine and for its people. We're implementing responsive measures, including economic sanctions. If Russia further escalates, we will follow with more severe measures. Russia and its acolytes can spin and can contort all they want, but the violations of international law are theirs. The loss of life, the wounding, the pain, the suffering are all their responsibilities. As it's been said, this is President Putin's choice. We shall respond to any further violations of the UN Charter collectively with our allies and with great determination. It is never too late to stop. It's never too late to make a turn to diplomacy, to dialogue, and to negotiation. Together with our partners in Europe, in NATO and the OSCE, Canada has made it very clear, and I repeat today, we are prepared to talk directly about mutual reductions in threats to the peace of Europe, to ensure peace, prosperity, and progress for all peoples living in this region that has, in this past century, known too much hardship, too much tragedy, too much loss of life. We are steadfast in our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. It's clear that the Russian Federation's actions directly threaten this sovereignty, this territorial integrity of Ukraine, and undermine the entire rules-based international order. Russia's hostile actions have to stop. Ukraine is not a mistake. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. Its autonomy must be respected and its territorial integrity restored. It is a solemn and considered decision of a people who have sought freedom and prosperity on their own terms. Most of us have referred to President Putin's speech of Monday. I noticed that my colleague from the Russian Federation did not. But in that speech, it's clear he denied the existence of the other. And when he did that, he made it apparent to the whole world that this is not about NATO. This is not about the European Union. This is about the existence and the right to existence of a member state of this organization. Mr. President, each and every member state that is here, we all, each and every one of us, has an obligation to uphold the territorial integrity of other states, to oppose invasions, and to insist on the peaceful resolution of disputes. That's what we've all signed up for. We didn't sign up for it just for ourselves. We didn't say this applies to us, but it doesn't apply to anyone else. It applies to all of us No matter how big or how small you may be, it applies to each and every one of us. No nation, no matter how powerful it may be, can take the law into its own hands. No nation has the right to use its might to destroy everyone else's rights. Speaking as a proud Canadian, I can say we worked for peace with justice in Korea. We worked hard during the Suez Crisis in 1956. And again, when we said there was no legal basis for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. These were not easy decisions. They were not necessarily popular in all quarters, or even among some of our allies. But they were based on a powerful belief in law, in rules, in common decency, and in multilateralism that is now embedded in our bones. We need to remember that invasion and war bring with them terrible losses and terrible hardships. There is no cause for celebration and triumph in these wars. There's only the squalor, the poverty, and the heartache of irreparable loss. There's been much talk about legacies. Let's be clear. That will be the only legacy of those who are responsible for this entirely avoidable conflict. All those countries formerly under the yoke of tyranny, communism, empire, they share this right with Ukraine. Canada's history and our proud association with all the people of Eastern Europe have led us to this point. We are partners in peace. We are partners in the quest for security and prosperity, and partners in the struggle for a world bound together by peaceful, friendly relations among nations, and a common commitment to democracy and the rule of law. Mr. President, in closing, I would say this. In the darkest days of World War II, it is said that a representative of the United States government, Harry Hopkins, was having a meeting with Winston Churchill, and at the end of that meeting he said, "Whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people." And so Canada says to Ukraine and to all those who are challenged, "Whither thou goest, we will go." Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada for your statements. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, we are gathered in this chamber because we, the peoples of the United Nations, all and each of us, have pledged to the UN Charter to, I quote, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human persons, in the equal rights of the men and women, and all nations, large and small. And as Secretary General rightly said, UN Charter is not a la carte menu. We are gathered in this chamber today to preserve these ideals and to protect the positive developments in the world's history that occurred during the 77 years of our organization has existed. Nobody should be allowed to reverse the course of the history and to question our common achievements. There is no return to the world from before the United Nations, the world of imperialism, colonialism, and the superiority of one country over another. And yet today, sadly enough, we are witness of such actions against Ukraine, with Russia openly questioning the right of a statehood of a fellow member state. Russia's recent actions have further compounded the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in non-government controlled territories of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Reported widespread cases of arbitrary detentions, torture and ill treatment of detainees, as well as a violation of human freedoms, fundamental rights, and these areas are extremely worrying. It seems like we have been driven to the very brink of a major security crisis whose scale might be unprecedented of proportion. In this situation, we cannot and we will not remain silent. Poland calls today for every member state of this respected organization to clearly reiterate the commitment to operate within the letter and the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations. Article 2 of the document stipulates clearly, and I quote again, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat of or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, end of quote. There is no place for indifference here. We call all in each member state to strongly condemn all acts of aggression and continuing policies of fait accompli pursued by Russia. This aggression must stop, and Russian forces must be withdrawn. We must assertively deplore such manifestations of neo-imperialism and possessiveness. Having learned from our history, Poland stands with those who choose freedom over bondage, the rules of international law over brutal force, and peace over conflict. Therefore, we shall continue to firmly stand by our neighbors, Ukraine and its people. We support Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We strongly believe in the right of every state to pursue its own foreign policy, including the freedom of choice of alliances and partnership. Distinguished delegates, the world would be better, a safer place if all countries respected the fundamental rights of fellow member states. Today, we cry out, stop denying them to Ukraine, and stop denying them in so many other troubled places around the world. Despite recent setbacks, Poland believes in diplomacy as a mediation being the only path of peaceful resolution of conflicts. Therefore, as the current chairmanship in office of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, we have proposed to launch a new initiative called Renewed European Security Dialogue. We offer our good services to make it a success. Distinguished delegates, Mr. President, history has not ended. Let's move it forward together. Let's not allow any old resentments or past frustrations to hold you back. Большое спасибо. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Poland. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, Croatia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, and I will make a few additional remarks in my national capacity. Croatia reaffirms unwavering support to the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. In this spirit, we echo Secretary General's statement on Ukraine on Monday and yesterday. We reject Russia's decision to recognize the self-proclaimed regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as an act in clear violation of international law, from the UN Charter to the Minsk agreements. This regrettable step is gravely undermining efforts for a diplomatic solution to the crisis. We reiterate Croatia's consistent and principled position of non-recognition of the illegal annexation of Ukraine's Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We also continue to be worried about the militarization of the Crimean Peninsula, as well as by further attempts to restrict freedom of navigation through the Kerch Strait, including to and from the Sea of Azov. Croatia consistently supports a peaceful resolution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine by diplomatic means. We reiterate our full support for the efforts of the Normandy format, the Trilateral Contact Group, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as the other diplomatic initiatives and missions. Now is the time to engage constructively towards a sustainable and peaceful solution, with a view to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. We also remain deeply concerned with reports of serious violations and continuous deterioration of human rights and humanitarian situation in eastern Ukraine, as well as in Crimea. We continue to support critical protection, monitoring, reporting, and advocacy work of the UN High Representative for Human Rights and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. We are concerned with numerous ceasefire violations and support the work of OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, and in current circumstances, particularly ask Russia to ensure the personal safety of the monitors and to allow unhindered implementation of their duties under the agreed mandate. After 8 years of conflict, the deteriorating security situation in eastern Ukraine has dire consequences for all Ukrainians, especially millions of civilians living in and near the conflict zone. Distinguished delegates, we need no further threatening escalation. What is required is immediate return to dialogue based on international law, in particular the UN Charter and the Minsk agreements. The relevant General Assembly resolution on Ukraine, as well as the recommendation contained in the reports of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Croatia. And I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union, and I would like to make some additional remarks in my national capacity. Mr. President, we meet at a time when, as the Secretary General said, the UN and the international system are being tested. The decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independence of and send troops to the separatist-controlled territories in Ukraine is a violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It is also a violation of the UN Charter and of the Minsk agreements endorsed by the Security Council. We can only see these actions by Russia as a deliberate choice to further escalate an already volatile situation. The Netherlands strongly condemns these acts and has responded firmly in close coordination with our partners. Any further escalation will be met with a similarly firm response. We call on Russia to reverse its illegal decisions, to immediately withdraw its troops, and to engage seriously and in good faith in dialogue with Ukraine to find a diplomatic solution. Mr. President, unfortunately, this is not a new situation. Russian violation of international law in Ukraine already started 8 years ago. The illegal annexation of Crimea and the ongoing destabilizing role of Russia in Donbass go directly against Article 2, as just quoted by the Permanent Representative of Canada. Like many others, I therefore reiterate my country's strong commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized borders, so including Crimea and its adjacent waters. Mr. President, the events of the past 8 years have already come at considerable cost for the affected population. As the Secretary General said, in a situation of conflict, it is the citizens that suffer first and suffer most. We therefore thank the Secretary General and all UN agencies for their continuous support to the people through its humanitarian operations and human rights efforts. We also thank the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission for the indispensable work of their monitors. As the OHCHR reports clearly show, the human rights situation on the illegally occupied Crimean Peninsula and in the non-government controlled areas in eastern Ukraine remains deeply concerning. Residents of the peninsula face systematic restrictions of fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of expression, religion or belief and association, and the right to peaceful assembly. The Kingdom of the Netherlands urgently calls on Russia to respect the human rights on the Crimean Peninsula and to allow full access for human rights monitors. Mr. President, when talking about the occupied territories in Ukraine, I cannot but touch upon flight MH17 that was shot down over the east of Ukraine on the 17th of July 2014. This terrible tragedy caused the death of 298 innocent civilians from 17 different countries, including 196 of my own compatriots. Since that day, the Netherlands has, together with many international partners, called for truth, justice, and accountability. This is what the victims and their next of kin deserve. The start in March 2020 of the criminal trial has been a very important step towards finding the truth, establishing justice, and holding those responsible to account. At the same time, the criminal investigation continues, and we call upon all countries, including Russia, to fully cooperate with this investigation in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2166. Let me end by reiterating that sustainable peace and stability in the region will only be possible if the Russian Federation moves away from the current path of escalation by fully respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and returning to the path of dialogue and negotiations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Netherlands. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues, par la Charte des Nations Unies, nous, États membres, nous sommes engagés à pratiquer la tolérance, à vivre en paix l'un avec l'autre dans un esprit de bon voisinage et à unir nos forces pour maintenir la paix et la sécurité internationale. Nous nous retrouvons aujourd'hui, beaucoup l'ont déjà dit, à la croisée des chemins. Ou pour reprendre les mots du secrétaire général, les principes de la Charte ne constituent pas un menu à la carte. Nous devons tous les appliquer, à tout moment et dans leur ensemble. La reconnaissance par la Fédération de Russie des régions ukrainiennes de Donetsk et Luhansk dans leurs frontières administratives comme États indépendants constitue une violation de l'intégrité territoriale et de la souveraineté de l'Ukraine et donc une violation manifeste du droit international, en particulier de la Charte des Nations Unies. La Suisse condamne ces violations par la Russie. En reconnaissant l'indépendance de ces régions, la Russie a aussi violé les accords de Minsk qu'elle a co-signés. Ces accords servent de base à la désescalade et à la résolution politique pacifique du conflit dans l'est de l'Ukraine. En tant que membre du groupe de contact trilatéral, la Russie a l'obligation de soutenir la mise en œuvre des accords de Minsk. Elle s'est également engagée à les mettre en œuvre par le biais de la résolution 2202 du Conseil de sécurité. La Suisse est fortement préoccupée par l'envoi de troupes russes dans l'est de l'Ukraine et par le risque élevé d'une escalade militaire. Elle appelle la Russie à respecter ses obligations internationales et à revenir sur ses actes, ainsi qu'à retirer ses troupes et à contribuer à la désescalade. La Suisse réitère son plein soutien à l'indépendance, à la souveraineté et à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine à l'intérieur de ses frontières internationalement reconnues. Mon pays appelle tous les acteurs à respecter le droit international, notamment le droit international humanitaire et les droits de l'homme. La population civile, lourdement éprouvée, les personnes hors de combat et les infrastructures civiles doivent être protégées. Les besoins humanitaires sont élevés. Face à cette crise, la Suisse souligne le rôle essentiel de l'Organisation pour la sécurité et la coopération en Europe et de sa mission spéciale d'observation. Cette mission civile et non armée doit pouvoir remplir son mandat sans interférence et avoir un accès sûr et sécurisé à toute l'Ukraine. Mon pays continue de soutenir la mission et notre personnel y restera engagé. Nous en appelons à la poursuite d'une résolution diplomatique et politique du conflit et saluons l'offre de bons offices du secrétaire général des Nations unies. Monsieur le Président, cela fait 8 ans que cette Assemblée se réunit chaque année en réaffirmant son soutien à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, suite à l'annexion de la République autonome de Crimée et de la ville de Sevastopol par la Fédération de Russie. Tous les ans, mon pays, comme beaucoup d'autres, réitère sa condamnation de l'annexion comme un acte contrevenant au droit international. Depuis 8 ans, la population civile affectée par le conflit voit son espoir légitime pour un avenir plus sûr et plus pacifique déçu. Il est grand temps que cela change. La violence engendre la violence. Elle n'est jamais une solution. Les conflits doivent être résolus par des moyens diplomatiques. Le chemin du dialogue doit toujours rester ouvert. La Suisse reste à disposition pour soutenir tous les efforts dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
President, 中方对乌克兰局势的演变表示关注。中国关于维护各国主权和领土完整的立场是一贯的。联合国宪章的宗旨和原则也应当得到共同维护。同时，我们注意到，乌克兰问题有着复杂的历史经纬和现实因素，演变至今是一系列因素共同作用的结果。当前形势下，有关各方都要保持克制，避免任何可能加剧紧张局势的行动。中方呼吁各方认识到落实安全不可分割原则的重要性，继续开展对话协商，在平等和相互尊重的基础上，继续通过和平方式寻求解决彼此关切的合理方案。我们欢迎并鼓励一切致力于推动外交解决的努力。谢谢你，主席先生。
I thank the distinguished representative of China. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Mr. President, colleagues, Today's annual UN General Assembly debate on Ukraine takes place at a critical time for Ukraine, for Europe, and for our international community. Consistent with the UN Charter and as members of the General Assembly, it is our responsibility to do all that we can do to avoid the deadly consequences of war. We know only too well that the cost of conflict falls on civilians, with a disproportionate burden carried by women, children, and the elderly. Death, injury, displacement, loss of critical infrastructure, reduced access to healthcare and education, and the curtailment of human rights and freedoms. This is why New Zealand stands so strongly opposed to Russia's deliberate and provocative actions taken in the last few days. Russia's actions represent a clear breach of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a sharp violation of international law and the Minsk agreements. New Zealand strongly supports the sovereign right of any state to determine its own future, including in terms of its security relationships. We have been consistent in expressing our strong support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and international diplomatic efforts to find a peaceful solution. There is no basis under international law for the recognition of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Their recognition by Russia and the deployment of Russian troops into the Donetsk and Luhansk regions undermines diplomatic efforts towards a de-escalation of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. New Zealand is deeply concerned that this is a calculated act by Russia to create a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine. Everyone in this chamber knows that a military invasion is an act of aggression and a violation of one of the most fundamental principles of international law. We join the Secretary-General in being deeply concerned about the perversion of the concept of peacekeeping. We agree that when troops of one country enter the territory of another country without its consent, they are not peacekeepers at all. Recent increases in ceasefire violations and civilian casualties in the conflict zones in the Donbas region are of great concern. Human rights violations in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics and in Russian-occupied Crimea are very troubling. New Zealand joins the international community in calling for human rights violations in the Donbas region to cease. We encourage Russia, Ukraine, and other parties to intensify dialogue, including through a return to the Normandy format, with a focus on bringing an urgent de-escalation of tension. We call on Russia and all parties to respect international humanitarian law. And we call on Russia to commit to dialogue to resolve its security concerns, to act in the interests of peace and the principles of the United Nations, and to act consistently with its responsibilities as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Russia's continued efforts to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine represent one of the most significant risks to international peace and security for decades. The impacts of such a conflict will not be confined to Europe. It will further destabilize the international community at a time when geostrategic uncertainty is already high. The international rules system is under pressure, and the global economy remains fragile, all compounded by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a dangerous time. We are at a critical juncture. but it is one where we believe that diplomacy must prevail in preventing a conflict that would have tragic consequences for Ukraine, for Europe, for Russia, and for the world. New Zealand supports the Secretary-General's rallying call to resolve this crisis without further bloodshed. We stand ready to support international diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the crisis in Ukraine in any way we can. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Mr. President, Italy aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and wishes to add the following remarks of its own. We strongly condemn the decision by the Russian Federation to recognize the independence of the self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Lugansk and to deploy Russian forces in the Donbas region. These acts are unacceptable violations of Ukraine's democratic sovereignty and territorial integrity, are inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and contradict the Minsk agreements endorsed by the Security Council and of which the Russian Federation is a signatory party. The EU has already responded to these violations with additional restrictive measures, including on economic relations and trade with the non-governmental controlled areas, in the financial sphere with asset freeze of some banks and restrictions on sovereign debt, as well as against individuals and entities responsible for undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine. In line with UN General Assembly Resolution 68/262, Italy also reaffirms its non-recognition of the illegal annexation of the Crimea Peninsula and reiterates its unwavering support and commitment to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. This position has been stated by Italy also in its capacity as the current presidency of the Council of Europe. We call on Russia to reconsider its decisions to de-escalate tensions, to withdraw military forces from Ukraine's territory, and to fully abide by its international commitments. As the Secretary General, whose efforts we appreciate, pointed out yesterday and today, we need de-escalation now, and now is the time to return to negotiations. We urge Russia to pursue dialogue on security issues through the US-Russia Strategic Stability Dialogue, the NATO-Russia Council, and the OSCE. We commend the renewed OSCE European Security Dialogue launched by the Polish OSCE chairmanship in office, and we encourage Russia to engage constructively in it. While the offer of dialogue remains standing, any further military initiative against Ukraine would trigger an additional united and firm response. Mr. President, after almost 8 years of conflict and in light of the latest developments, we are more and more concerned about the condition of the civilian population in Ukraine, which continues to bear the heaviest burden. It is of the utmost importance to provide effective and unhindered assistance to those in need and to help preserve the economic and financial stability of Ukraine, which is being further undermined by the current crisis environment. In this regard, Italy intends to support Ukraine with an amount of around 110 million euros in aid credit and grants. Building on the support that it has provided since 2014, Italy remains committed to do its part together with its European partners and in full solidarity with the Ukrainian people. Mr. President, Italy will continue to be actively engaged in close coordination with its European partners and with its allies to promote a peaceful solution to this crisis and to avert a conflict at the heart of Europe, which would have disastrous humanitarian and economic consequences. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this morning. We shall hear the remaining speakers at 3 p.m. today in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.